Well, in the first two lectures, I've outlined the rather complex relations between the Bible and human rights. The Bible does not have a discourse of human rights. Ethical priorities are expressed as divine commands and laws from a theocentric rather than an anthropocentric point of view. Nonetheless, some rights can be inferred from laws, as in the case of the right to property inferred from stealing. It is certainly possible to conceive of human rights as rights granted by the Creator, and that is in fact what is affirmed in the American Declaration of Independence. Even when the Bible implies or entails rights, however, these are not human rights in the sense affirmed in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. In many cases, they're positive laws of ancient Israel or Judah with limited application. For example, the rights of slaves that may be inferred from laws in Exodus or Deuteronomy. The Bible notably does not affirm that human beings as such have a right to life or a right to liberty, and it does not accord equal rights to all human beings. This may come as a surprise, given that the Bible, and more specifically the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, is a powerful advocate for social justice. The view of justice that we find in the Hebrew Bible is essentially that the strong should not oppress the weak. In part, this is a matter of social equilibrium. If the rich add house to house and field to field, it becomes difficult for the poor to get enough. It is also a matter of respecting the human dignity of the poor, as when the prophet Amos denounces those who sell the poor for a pair of sandals. This concern for the weaker members of society is certainly congenial to the idea of human rights, and may in fact have contributed to the rise of human rights in the modern world. Nonetheless, the Bible stops short of affirming that humanity has basic rights simply in virtue of being human. These considerations give rise to two questions. First, is human rights the optimal lens to consider ethical questions? And second, how and to what degree can the Bible still inform our thinking on ethics in the modern world? I've already referred to the famous or notorious dismissal of human rights as nonsense on stilts by Jeremy Bentham, and the more recent dismissal as fiction by Alistair MacIntyre. In both cases, the force of the critique lies in the fact that there is no universal system in this world that could guarantee these rights, short of eschatological vindication in a final judgment. But that critique, I submit, misses the point of human rights discourse. The point is not whether such rights are recognized, or indeed whether they're self-evident. The point is whether such rights, the point is whether they should be recognized. This recognition in practice is difficult, if not impossible, to achieve, but it is important as setting a goal for ethical treatment of our fellow human beings. Another critique of human rights focuses on their supposed obsession with the rights of individuals, without regard to the communities in which they participate. Harvard professor Mary Ann Glendon has charged that current American rights talk tends to present rights as absolute, individual, and independent of any necessary relation to responsibilities. Glendon does not claim that this is true about all rights talk, and there is no doubt that the charge has some substance, that sometimes people do press rights claims in that way. Focus on the rights of individuals is often antithetical to the common good. But this is a misuse of human rights. In the classic formulations, the rights of individuals are always limited by respect for the rights of others. And so I don't think the misuse, which does occur, should invalidate the whole idea. A third kind of critique is more difficult to address. Some people question the universality of human rights and regard them as a projection of Western values. At the time of the UN Declaration, the American Anthropological Association rejected the idea of human rights because of the diversity of culture. I am reminded of a story, at least, about an anthropologist at the University of Chicago in the 1930s who said that people had no right to criticize Germany, that it is up to every society to organize its values as it sees fit. That would be kind of a radicalization of the cultural diversity argument. More recently, postmodern thinkers tend to reject any moral absolutes that would be persuasive to everyone. After the attacks on 9/11, Stanley Fish wrote an editorial, I think in the New York Times, arguing that the terrorists had a history that supplied them with reasons and motives for their actions no less than we do. And that is no doubt true. Whether it means that you can't then say that one is better than another, or that one is right and another is wrong, is, I think, still a different question. Third world spokesmen often regard human rights discourse as a self-serving cover for the ulterior national interests, especially on the part of dominant countries like the United States. And here again, I don't dispute that those charges have some validity, and that we do get specious human rights arguments made from time to time. That charge is difficult to refute because no one can speak for people from different cultures. It raises the question whether we can truly speak of a common human experience. I mean, ultimately, we can only speak of our own experience. But while it is undeniably true that human rights discourse can be used in a self-serving manner, I think the idea of a common human experience should not be lightly dismissed. Life and death, joy and suffering are the common lot of humanity. And it should, I think, be possible to transcend local cultures and speak of shared human values. But that, I think, will probably be a contentious issue still for quite some time. But I would like to defend the more traditional idea of a common human experience as, I think, valid and necessary. The idea of human rights has not always enjoyed the support of Christians. That is perhaps an understatement. Insofar as Enlightenment theories of human rights dispensed with any appeal to God or Creator, they were often regarded as hostile to Christian faith, and indeed their advocates also saw religious belief as a source of opposition. To a great degree, the whole discourse of human rights that arose in the Enlightenment arose as a critique of medieval Christianity, as something, there was assertion over against medieval Christianity. And it took quite a while for the churches, and I'm thinking especially of the Catholic Church, to which I belong, to come around on that. Joan Lockwood O'Donovan wrote a close analysis of the history of the concept of subjective rights in the light of earlier theological political conceptualization, reveals a progressive antagonism between the older Christian tradition of political right and the newer voluntarist, individualist, and subjectivist orientation. She would convey the contrasting logic of the two orientations as follows, where in the older patristic and medieval tradition, God's right established a matrix of divine, natural, and human laws, or objective obligations, that constituted the ordering justice. In the newer tradition, God's right established discrete rights possessed by individuals originally and by communities only derivatively. I would probably put it that the essential difference is between theocratic and anthropocentric views of justice. But, the one up comes from above, and the other comes from below. And the issue, and probably you see it most clearly in the question of gay rights, of whether there is such a thing as things that are objectively right and wrong, or whether things are only right or wrong depending on whether they harm or help other human beings. In the wake of the French Revolution, emphasis on human rights was often perceived as an attack on Christian assumptions of a God-given order. By the 20th century, however, many Christian leaders came to recognize that human rights discourse could serve to advance justice, and found ways to co-opt it as part of the Christian message. But even when the major religious traditions came to appreciate the shared interest in social justice, some Christian theologians disparaged the idea of human rights. Anders Nygren, a Swedish Lutheran bishop writing in the 1930s, in a famous book called Agape and Eros, argued that while the Old Testament is all about justice, the New Testament is all about love. On Nygren's interpretation, Jesus was against every attempt to regulate fellowship with God by the principle of justice. Nygren's argument was not that justice should be supplemented by love. Love should replace considerations of justice. Motivated justice must give place to unmotivated love. As another theologian of that era, Emil Brunner, put it, love does not render to the other what is his due, what belongs to him by right, but gives of its own, gives precisely that to which the other has no right. In a similar line of Christian, specifically Protestant tradition, Stanley Hauerwas asserts that Christians do not believe that we have inalienable rights. Hauerwas has even claimed that justice is a bad idea for Christians. Love, says St. Paul, does not seek that which is its own, and so does not insist on rights. In this perspective, the teaching of Jesus on social justice is an appeal for charity rather than an assertion of human rights. The tendency to dismiss consideration of human rights in the name of a higher ideal of love seems to me short-sighted. The different emphases in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, where the Older Testament emphasizes justice and the later one emphasizes love, is due in large part to different contexts. The Hebrew Bible in large part legislates for society. The New Testament primarily addresses personal morality. It is asking how people should behave rather than what society requires. To say that people should act out of love rather than defend their own rights is all very well as an ideal. But the discourse on human rights is primarily concerned with the rights of others, especially the rights of the weaker members of society. One cannot claim to love these people in any meaningful sense of the word without being concerned that justice is done to them. The Christian ideal may call for more than justice, but it cannot be construed as calling for less. The ideal of loving one's neighbor requires justice as a baseline, the minimal acceptable behavior. The committee that drafted the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights had a strong Christian component. Jacques Maritain was a prominent Catholic theologian. Charles Malik was a Lebanese Christian who had studied in Germany with Martin Heidegger and at Harvard. Eleanor Roosevelt and John Humphrey, a lawyer who directed the United Nations Human Rights Division for 2 decades, were also profoundly shaped by Christian values. They did not, however, invoke God or Creator because they wanted their declaration to be universally acceptable. Consequently, human rights could not be grounded in the Bible or in any particular religious or cultural tradition. They could be, and inevitably were, informed by particular traditions, including the biblical, but they could not be derived from them in an exclusive way without excluding the other traditions. It was quite possible, nonetheless, to claim that human rights were affirmed by religious traditions, and indeed that religious values were central to them. But as we have seen, the foundational human rights to life, liberty, and equality are not, in fact, affirmed in the Bible. To claim biblical support for these rights, we have to accept that the Bible is a historical document shaped to a significant degree by the prejudices and limitations of its time, and that its significance lies to a great degree in implications that were not fully realized in the biblical text. The humanistic principle of ethics fundamental to all others is some formulation of the golden rule that we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us, or the negative formulation of the Talmud, what is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This principle is affirmed in many cultures, East and West. It is also the principle underlying the concern for the alien in the book of Exodus. You shall not oppress a resident alien. You know the heart of an alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. It is explicitly formulated by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. It is a humanistic principle insofar as the criterion is what we would wish other people to do to us. It does not appeal to a transcendent moral order that is objectively right, but to empathy with others who are assumed to be basically like us. The Bible provides considerable support for this principle, but not everything in the Bible is in accordance with it. René Cassin's argument that the concept of human rights comes from the Bible depended in part on the belief that the first article of the Declaration on Human Rights, which said that all human beings should act toward one another in a spirit of brotherhood, corresponded to the biblical injunction in Leviticus 19 to love your neighbor as yourself. This injunction is singled out by Jesus in the Gospels as second only to the commandment to love God with one's whole heart, the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. And also it's singled out in Jewish tradition by Rabbi Akiba. Leviticus 19 is part of the Holiness Code in Leviticus 17 to 26. It is characteristic of the Holiness Code that moral laws are interspersed with ritual ones. The famous passage in chapter 19 reads, "You shall not hate your brother in your heart. You shall reprove your kinsman and not incur guilt because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor," the Hebrew word is reah, "like yourself. I am the Lord." Most contemporary scholars agree that the neighbor, or the reah, in Leviticus 19 refers to fellow members of the Israelite or Judahite community. That view has been challenged. The word reah is in no way restricted to Israelites elsewhere in the Bible. It's used of Babylonians and it's used of Egyptians. But as Harry Orlinsky argued half a century ago, the context is determinative in Leviticus 19. The preceding verse says not to hate your brother and warns that one must reprove your kinsman, and finally and most decisively, you shall not bear a grudge against any of your people. It seems clear from this that the reah in view is one of your people, a fellow Israelite. No doubt the author was thinking primarily of males, but presumably the injunction also applies to women and children by extension. At least we'll give it the benefit of the doubt on that one. At the same time, it should be noted that reah is more inclusive than the family term brother and broadens the scope of concern beyond blood relations. To love this fellow Israelite is to be concerned for his welfare. This again is clear from the context. According to Leviticus 19, 15 to 16, you shall not render an unjust judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great. With justice you shall judge your fellow. You shall not go around as a slanderer among your people. You shall not profit by the blood of your neighbor. Earlier we read in 1913 that one should not oppress the reah or defraud him in any way. Love, then, is not a matter of emotion, but of justice. Love is seen in concrete actions, and this is why love can be commanded, as feeling and emotion could not be. In the immediate context, to love is contrasted with to hate in your heart or to bear a grudge. The most difficult part of the formulation in Leviticus 19, however, is the use of the expression like yourself or as yourself, Hebrew kamoka. Debate here has centered on the question of whether it should be construed adverbially or adjectivally. Either reading is grammatically possible. The traditional interpretation found in Ibn Ezra takes it adverbially, qualifying how one should love the neighbor in the same way that you would love yourself. The alternative adjectival interpretation takes the phrase to mean, you shall love your neighbor who is like you. This interpretation is most famously associated with Martin Buber, although it had earlier precedence in Jewish interpretation. The Greek text of Ben Sira observes that every living thing loves what is like it, and every person his neighbor. All living beings associate with their own kind, and people stick close to those like themselves. The Hebrew, however, bears less similarity to Leviticus. All flesh loves its kind, and every person the one who is like him. But Ben Sira was offering an observation about human nature, not a commandment to do something that doesn't come naturally. The understanding of the expression as "who is like you" is complicated by a second love commandment in Leviticus 19, where the object is not the neighbor, the fellow Israelite, but the alien. When an alien, and the word is ger, sojourns with you in your land, you shall not oppress him. The alien who sojourns with you shall be to you as one of your native born, and you shall love the alien like yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The ger, the resident alien, must not be oppressed or exploited, but must instead be loved as a native citizen. The word ger, translated alien, occurs 92 times in the Hebrew Bible, referring to someone who lives in Israel as a resident alien. 21 of these occurrences are in Leviticus, primarily in the Holiness Code. The term does not apply to all foreigners. The ger is one who has settled in the land for some time and has special legal status. It is practically a technical term. The ger is a person, possibly a family or group, conceded a certain juridical status because of the fact that he has settled among a foreign tribe or people. Leviticus repeatedly commands that the ger be treated like the native born, but he is still different. Laws pertaining to defilement of the land or the sanctuary apply both to native born and to aliens. Laws relating to specific events in Israel's history, such as the Passover, are optional for the ger. Since the ger, by definition, is not an Israelite, many scholars conclude that, like yourself, here cannot have an adjectival force, meaning the alien who is like you, but must be interpreted in the traditional way by indicating how the alien is to be loved. But the motivating clause that follows, "for you were aliens in the land of Egypt," suggests that the alien is like you. And I must say, this is a point at which I've changed my mind over the years, because I had kind of assumed it meant love the neighbor the way you love yourself. And I'm coming round to the idea that it probably does mean the neighbor who is like you, because he is like you. You should love him because you have been in his situation. This reason is often given in support of concern for the alien. It is not a matter of ontology, and it is not grounded in the creation of all human beings in the image of God. In that case, there would be no reason to distinguish the alien from other kinds of foreigners. It is a matter of analogous experience, and calls to mind the golden rule: one should treat others as one would wish to be treated oneself. The Holiness Code and the priestly document repeatedly state, "You shall have one law for the ger and for the native born." The fact that the Israelites have been aliens in the land of Egypt means that the ger is like the Israelite in a way that other foreigners are not. But on either interpretation of like yourself, one is supposed to treat the alien like the Israelite, that is, like oneself. In all of this, a few things are clear. First, the love command, as we find it in Leviticus, is not universal. It is primarily concerned with relations within the Israelite community. It extends to aliens who live among the Israelites, but not to foreigners in general. It is not quite an affirmation of common humanity or of putative rights based simply on being human. Second, love here is not a matter of feelings, but of practice. To love one's neighbors like oneself is to treat them as you yourself would wish to be treated. To treat aliens like oneself is to treat them as one would treat native-born Israelites. Here again, we're dealing with something less than human rights as they're conceived in the modern context. But here again, you see something that goes part of the way towards that, because it is at least extending the concern beyond your own people and recognizing at least one class of aliens who are like you. And I would suggest, if you thought about it long enough, you'd find that other aliens are like you too. In the New Testament, Jesus cites the Septuagint translation, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," in Mark 12:31. The adverbial meaning of "as yourself" is generally accepted in the New Testament context. John Mayer, who wrote this multi-volume series called A Marginal Jew, points out that nothing in the text suggests a different frame of reference from the original reading in Leviticus, or prevents the reader from understanding neighbor as fellow Israelite. But the parallel in Luke, which provides the setting for the parable of the Good Samaritan, does broaden the horizon. The most striking innovation in the Gospels is undoubtedly the command to love your enemies. Again, the command concerns actions rather than feelings. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Or alternatively, pray for those who persecute you, in Matthew. This commandment is exceptional in ancient literature, and indeed in modern literature too, and is not repeated in the New Testament. In the Johannine tradition, the love command is directed to disciples to love one another as I have loved you, but there the purpose seems to be to sustain a group of Christians who felt besieged by a hostile world and were convinced that the world hated them. In light of the command to love your enemies, however, it seems very likely that Jesus' concern was not just for inter-community relations, but for all humanity, as children of the Father in heaven, who makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. Perhaps the greatest contribution of Jesus in the Gospels to the idea of human rights is his concern for the least of the brethren, the outcasts of society, especially in the Matthean judgment scene or in the parable of the wedding feast. Even in the case of the judgment scene, the brethren in question may be members of the community of Christ followers. In any case, the vantage point is not the rights of the brethren, but an exhortation to charity. And in this, the gospel was quite in line with Jewish attitudes of the day, where the word for justice, tzedakah, which traditionally means righteousness, came to mean almsgiving. Charity is virtuous behavior on the part of those who can afford it. But if we look at the problem of poverty from the viewpoint of the poor, or from the viewpoint of society as a whole, charity doesn't provide a very reliable solution. The complex relation of the Bible to human rights can perhaps be most easily illustrated from the case of slavery, if only because no one in the modern world, I hope, is likely to defend the institution. And if I'm repeating a little of what I've already said about slavery, it is because it seems to me to be maybe the easiest case where people cannot deny that the bottom line in the Bible is inadequate and needs to be complemented in some way. The opening chapter of Genesis already declares that humanity, male and female, is made in the image of God. One would think that that in itself should make it obvious that slavery was wrong. If that were not enough, the Israelite people experienced slavery in Egypt and looked on their deliverance as the definitive revelation of their God. Yet the critique of slavery in biblical law is slow and halting. The earliest laws in Exodus limit the time that a Hebrew male can be kept in slavery, but the limitation doesn't apply to female slaves. Even a female slave has rights in Exodus. She may not be sold to a foreign people, and if the master takes her for himself, she has marital rights. But her rights are less than those of a male slave. The unfairness of this arrangement must have become obvious even in antiquity. Deuteronomy applies the same law to male and female slaves. It also tells slave owners not to send slaves out empty-handed when they release them, knowing that freedom does not automatically supply people with a livelihood. But it still makes provision for people to remain in slavery because they supposedly love their masters, and one has to read that with a little bit of suspicion. Finally, Leviticus bans the taking of Hebrew slaves, but allows the Gentiles can be taken as slaves in perpetuity, even though Leviticus comes from the same priestly tradition that so nobly declared all humanity to be in the image of God. The authors did not consider how that principle should be applied to Gentiles. But then it would take more than 2,000 years before Christians, or a majority of them, acknowledged that black Africans too were in the image of God and should not be enslaved. The laws of the Pentateuch show clear progress in imposing limitations on slavery. And I would emphasize here that these laws are amended and revised within the Bible itself. And that, I think, undercuts any idea that because the Bible says something, it's the last word on the topic. It isn't. These laws were not always observed in practice. There is a poignant story in the book of Nehemiah, almost a century after the Babylonian exile, where people complained that they were forced to sell their children as slaves to pay the king's tax, even though our flesh is the same as that of our children are the same as their children. In Nehemiah 2, the context was inner Judahite. The people were complaining about their Jewish kin. It isn't clear that Nehemiah would have been equally sympathetic to Gentiles who had to sell their children. In Leviticus, empathy is at least extended to the resident alien. This is a limited step, but it is a step in the direction of the appreciation of common humanity. The various biblical laws on slavery tell us something about the nature of biblical law. It is not eternal or unfailingly valid. It is subject to revision, and it is not unfailingly right. Like all laws, it involves a compromise between high-minded principles and human prejudice and vested interest. Slave owners in ancient Israel were reluctant to lose the economic advantages of slave ownership, just as slave owners in 19th century America were. If we look to biblical laws for guidance, then we need to look to the high-minded principles, not to the actual applications, which were often compromised. While slavery provides an example that should be uncontroversial in the 21st century, and I say that hopefully, and not without a few doubts as to whether there aren't people out there who think there was nothing wrong with slavery. But the same holds true with regard to other major human rights that are claimed in modern times but not affirmed in the biblical record. The right to life remains controversial, not in the sense that the Lord can take it away, which he obviously can, but whether human beings can legitimately do so. No society condones murder, you might say by definition, because murder is killing that society does not condone. But most societies have followed the biblical principle that people forfeit their right to life by certain offenses. In modern times, the use of the death penalty has declined precipitously, at least in countries that we consider civilized. No one today would claim that the death penalty is appropriate in all the cases where it is prescribed in the Bible. There is still no consensus as to whether it should be outlawed. If one were guided by the principle of doing unto others as we would have them do unto us, and of loving your enemy, it would be difficult to justify the death penalty, unless it could be shown that the person in question would pose a danger to others if he or she remained alive. Killing in self-defense, whether by individuals or by nations at war, is justified, but the burden of proof rests with the person who claims to be in mortal danger. The Golden Rule also casts light on contested rights that are deemed by some to conflict with an objective moral order, such as gay rights. If we should do unto others as we would have them do unto us, then we should respect the rights of gays or lesbians to seek fulfillment of their desires and needs unless they can be shown to infringe on the rights of others. The claim that their lifestyle violates a divine commandment or an absolute moral law is open to criticism in light of what we have seen and of the biblical laws on slavery. In other words, when something is proclaimed to be an absolute moral law, you have to ask who was proclaiming that and in what context. These laws were not final or absolute, the laws on slavery. They could be changed and amended in light of new circumstances or in light of reflection on basic principles. The biblical laws on slavery are now seen to be inappropriate because they violate our modern understanding of human dignity. But they also violate basic tenets of the biblical tradition, such as the view that all humanity was created in the image of God. In fact, most, if not all, of the stories in the Bible that offend modern sensibilities can be critiqued just as well on biblical as on humanistic grounds. This is true of the subordination of women. It is true of the slaughter of the Canaanites. If we're to use the Bible to guide our ethics in the modern world, we need to distinguish between fundamental principles, such as the commandment to love our neighbor, and specific laws or precedents which often fall short of the ideal. The fundamental principles of the Bible are generally congenial to the idea of human rights, even when those rights are not affirmed in the biblical corpus. In conclusion, the claim of René Cassin that the concept of human rights comes from the Bible was certainly an overstatement. At no point in either testament do we find the idea that all human beings are free and equal in rights, or indeed that do we find a discourse of rights at all. Nonetheless, the claim was not altogether without substance. We do find a consistent concern for weaker members of society, and at least in some cases, that concern is grounded in common humanity rather than in covenant law. The most basic biblical doctrine is that all human beings are creatures of the same God, and therefore share a common humanity. The neighbor who is like us is not just one who had similar experiences, but every human being as such. This is a fundamental contribution to the idea of human rights that should not be underestimated. It is strengthened by the affirmation in Genesis that all human beings are created in the image of God. The Bible then may be said to contain some of the seeds of the modern idea of human rights, but it differs from the modern human rights perspective in two fundamental ways. One is that it proposes ideals of conduct to which we should aspire, rather than rights that we should claim or respect. This is especially true of the New Testament. We can debate which is the better approach. Claims of rights can be divisive. They can be used as vehicles for the pursuit of self-interest. But exhortations to charity leave a lot to human goodwill and are not always effective means to remedy the ills of society. Charity and almsgiving may feed the hungry and clothe the naked, but they do not address the systemic conditions that cause people to be hungry and naked in the first case. They do not address the demand for justice. The second fundamental difference is between a theocentric perspective to an anthropocentric one, between an order where morality is given from above and one where it is conceived as a response to human needs and desires. This difference is especially obvious in the matter of gay rights, but it applies in other areas too. In this respect, the modern alliance between Christianity or Judaism and human rights seems to me to be an uneasy one. Those like Pope John Paul II, who insist that human rights must be grounded in transcendent truth, can make common cause with humanistic human rights advocates on many issues, but there is nonetheless a fundamental discrepancy between their ultimate understanding and goals. The biblical affirmation that the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, articulated most powerfully in the book of Job, is ultimately a strategy for dealing with the vicissitudes of life. It is a strategy of resignation that acknowledges the limits of what we can control. The affirmation of human rights represents a different strategy, which accords more responsibility to humanity for what happens on earth. On that approach, it is for humanity to establish what rights people should have and then work to acknowledge them. That strategy may be conceived as an outgrowth of the biblical affirmation of common humanity and especially of the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. But it requires us to view the Bible as a launching pad for modern ethics, a source of suggestion and inspiration, rather than as a set of definitive answers or limiting rules.